So thank you again for this invitation to the Center of Latin American Studies here at Cornell. I wanted to, as you can see the topic here, Nyokaiku Sausakuna, negotiating indigenous identity through dance and music performance in the Central Andes. This is a topic I came across when I was speaking with one of my advisors, an ethnomusicologist who focuses on Native American groups here in North America and has also done some work in Australia. And so it has to deal with concepts of authenticity. I think in much of ethnomusicology, especially when we're dealing with groups here in the US, and in Canada, we don't talk about authenticity anymore. It's especially when it relates to music and dance production, and that's how we kind of have been able to move forward. There's a lot of indigenous rock musicians, indigenous punk musicians, and we don't expect these. We don't deny these people their indigeneity, and we don't deny that their expressions are indigenous expressions. And I think we struggle to do that in Latin America as a whole, and especially in Peru today. So there's a lot of questions regarding indigenous people. Who is indigenous and who is not. Very often we deny the indigenous identity of people in Latin America. So I wanted to go and start with the theoretical kind of background. So issues regarding the authenticity of Andean cultural expressions, so in the Andes, have plagued both recent and early Peruvian ethnomusicology. Early attempts by European ethnomusicologists, such as the French, the Darcourt couple, were motivated by a mission to safeguard what they considered the remnants of Inca music through ethnographic recordings and musical transcriptions. Similar concerns led the work of local self-taught ethnomusicologists such as Daniela Lomía Robles and Teodoro Balcárcer, who not only sought to record and transcribe this music into Western musical notation, but also build upon this musical legacy by arranging it and thus endowing it with harmonious mestizaje. It is this act of creativity that has most recently been policed by academics, who are quick to label their work as indigenista or revivalist, contesting its supposed authenticity based on their own Western musical conceptualizations of what Andean music should and should not be. Thus, the memory of a musical Inca past has transformed itself into a cultural policing from unlikely sources that most often come from the outside, creating a long-lasting discourse of authenticity that in many ways negates culture's fundamental ability to adapt and change, while remaining at its core unique in its identity. The cultural policing by scholars and traditionalists, most often from the hegemonic space of the cities and or from the West, lacks a true understanding and respect for the historical heterogeneity of the Andes and for the agency of indigenous cultural actors. Such is the case that even when approaching modern indigeneity, ethnomusicologists continue to ascribe to certain conceptualizations of what is authentic in the Andes and what is not. In his work, Imposing Harmony, Music and Society in Colonial Cusco, British historian Geoffrey Baker considers Ángel Rama's conceptualization of the lettered city as one that builds on Rama's concept, reimagining that the colonial imposition of order and harmony was not restricted to the architectural and lettered spaces, but also included an attempt to colonize the sound of the city. Baker denotes a colonialism that was intent on using music as a powerful tool and metaphor to order the world, to create harmony. However, he contests that this colonialism was not so much imposed as it was negotiated, and that the Western conceptualization of the city as civilized and the rural spaces as uncivilized never really took hold in Cusco. Therefore, even though Baker's archival research is focused solely on church music, it is his understanding of the pervasiveness of the Andean tradition of decentralized spaces of cultural and musical production that further problematizes the aforementioned discourse of authenticity. In addition to these, Baker's findings concerning the reliance of the colonial system on Andean musicians and their advanced musical skills, as well as the system's reliance on the culture of the Ayllu and of service reciprocity that speaks against the discourse of authenticity, which seeks to homogenize Andean musical production and in turn question the creativity of its performers. The heterogeneous nature of Andean musical traditions that existed during Inca times and in prior Andean civilizations is recorded in Felipe Guamampoma de Ayala's Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno, that aptly describes the hundreds of regional varieties of music and dance, taquilles and jailis, and the distinct musical instrumentation employed, but also in the ethnomusicological research of Isabel Aretz, Pulgar Vidal, and more recently Dale Olson, who used archaeological findings in their analysis. So I wanted to bring forth Baker's conceptualization of musical production, music and dance production outside of the cities, right? Because in the West, we understand civilization, music to come from the cities. And in the Andes, that concept never really took place. The music and dance and culture could come from the periphery. It didn't necessarily have to come from the hegemon. And so I wanted to look at, as a case study, my hometown of Jauja, right? Jauja is located in the Mantaro Valley, which is a very fertile valley. And it hasn't had enough study by any means. But the map on your left here, it's from one of the few studies that we have. It's an archaeological study of the household economies of the Sausa people, or the Sausa nation. So the Sausa nation existed before the Incan Empire, and we know it was distinct from the Huancas, which was a group of people, a nation right next to it, because they have their own linguistic differences in the way they speak Huanca or Xauxa. In the region, they also had a distinct dress attire that they used, and that this was also something that when the Incas took over these populations, they made sure that these distinctions remained clear. So they had a distinct political and economic system, and I think it's an interesting place to look at because it's not even today it's not a major city within the Andes. It's a small historic town and region. It's a region that encompasses 34 different districts, and it actually, because of its size and location, if you can see, it's pretty in the central Peru. It encompasses the Amazonian jungles and as well as the Andes. So you have all of these microclimates that happen in this zone. So we have there's 120 possible microclimates in the world. Peru has 74 of them, and just this region in Jauja has 64 of the different life zones. So it's a very unique, diverse area. As far as their political and economic systems, they follow the Andean systems of that come from even before the Incas, of the Ayllu. So these kinship ties that were both economic and sometimes through family, and also systems like the Minca of reciprocity. And the reciprocity that we've had could have been an equal reciprocity, so for two equal things, or you could have had a reciprocity such as in the Minca, where people from a higher status in the society would have given to people of lower statuses, so that you have this meeting ground. And these are concepts that remain today in some of the communities of these 34 districts of Jauja. They have retained their economic specializations as far as what they deal with or what kind of products they farm. And so here you have a more modern map, and here we have a map of what. So here we have a magnification of that. So we could look at this. Comes from a friend of mine who's an archaeologist who's doing a lot of work looking at Sausa and pre-Sausa cultures. And so we have the region of Jauja, and even if we consider Jauja itself a small hegemon within the periphery, there's a lot of, like I said, there's 34 districts that are distinct, and that they would definitely be the periphery, including the district of Yauyos, which we're gonna briefly look at for some of their cultural expressions. So the city of Jauja, it was historically the first capital of the Spanish Empire, but they quickly left the city because of its location. As we saw, it's not by the water by any means. It's 3,400 meters above sea level. And so it was not easy for them to get to this place. What I do want to mention, if I go back to the maps, is that because of its central location, it was a very important site within the Capacñan, the Inca Trail, and it houses today most of. It's the one site where we have the most storage systems for the Inca Empire. They could store food, they could store feathers, and because of its location, it was easy to go either south or north or east or west from there. So we think that's why they put that there. It's also, if you notice, Lima, it's not that far from it, and within Lima we had the religious site of Pachacamac, which was a very important deity at that point. So we also recognize, especially nowadays and through the work of Perales Munguia and others, that it wasn't just an important economic center, but it was also an important religious center. There was a big pilgrimage that took place through the Capacñan from Lima to the city of Jauja. And we see in places like in the Huarochiri manuscript that the Incas themselves had a very high regard for this place because of its religious importance, because of the deities there. And the Inca even mentioned that he would act as a Huaxa in this place, honoring the Sausa deities and so forth. Okay. So today, Jauja remains very much in the periphery, but again, it's distinct because of its location. It's still very near other places, especially Lima, and a lot of it is very. There's a lot of living culture. There's a lot of living culture that we tend to. We tend to perhaps think of as just folklore and simply folklore, and not as necessarily, true expressions, through development, through creativity of a people. So I wanted to touch base on the Andean and musical dance traditions as far as this goes. So Andean musical and dance traditions have been deeply relegated from the point of colonization through the Republican era and into the modern era. The utopic discourse of the literate city consigned the oral into obscurity. And I think that's important for all of us as researchers, because we tend to focus on tangible things that we can document. And I think for us, it's kind of difficult to delve into this oral, and that includes obviously dance and music. the music of the people of the Andes was included in this regard. However, the focus of colonization on the cities allowed rural spaces to continue to practice their musical and dance traditions. More so that even with time and the increasingly direct colonization of these rural spaces, it can be gauged that the imposition of certain Spanish cultural traits, such as musical instruments and harmonies, did not fully replace Andean musical traditions, but were instead adapted and reappropriated as Andean. Such is the case of the Andean guitar, the Andean mandolin, the Andean violin, the Andean harp, the Andean accordion, the Andean saxophone, etc. So that even though in the colonial period Andean musical traditions were deemed as demonic, and as such there were very strong efforts to extirpate it, history has proven that this was a failed effort, as there remain thousands of varieties of dances and huaynos in the distinct musical region of the Andes. This is evidenced in the more than 400 autochthonous dances registered in the region of Puno and enacted yearly in the Fiesta de la Candelaria in February. So that's one of the key points I think we have to think about when we talk about indigeneity and how mestizo something is, or how modern something is. I think oftentimes, I remember we were invited as Kuyaki, as a group, musical group, to play at the Smithsonian National Museum of the Native American Indian. And on my interview with one of the fellows there, he said, but you guys are very pure. You are very, you're truly indigenous. There's no, we don't want anything that's mestizo or, tainted in a way. And I think that's, like I said, again, a very pervasive discourse that is unrealistic at this point. It's been quite a while, so a lot of our so we can't mistake our capacity to adapt and appropriate different traits of colonial and republican culture as necessarily denying of our indigenousness. So a lot of the expressions that we have in this part of Peru, in Jauja, the musical instruments that we use are broadly European. Like I mentioned, we use the violin, we use the mandolin, and we use the saxophone. There's a documentary, if you want to look up, that it's called the El País de los Saxos, and it refers to Jauja. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are using these instruments in the way that they have been used before, and so that they are they are endemic at this point to our culture and to our Sausa identity. So the picture here is of one of the topics of my dissertation research, which is the tunantada. The tunantada, there are hundreds of dances in this the region of Jauja, but the tunantada is one that's very popular, attended by thousands of people every year on the 20th of January. And again, it represents a sort of pilgrimage also for the people of Jauja, because a lot of the people of Jauja have moved away to the cities or even to other countries, and they return in order to take to either dance or play music in the tunantada. So I think we have to remain cognizant of that. And this is one of the dance dramas that we have in the Andes, and it's a chance for the people within the Andes to represent their identities, and at the same time negotiate their identities each time they perform. So I think it takes into account also how important the performance aspect is for indigenous identity and for indigenous creativity, because since And there's and I think that also it doesn't just this backlash of what is authentic and what is not doesn't necessarily just come from academics, but from traditionalists themselves, even from cultural activists who are trying to safeguard the culture. So but it's a thin line that you can carry, and how do you let people express themselves and be creative while at the same time trying to preserve or safeguard a culture. So I think we have to be really careful as academics and even as people who work within folklore to not think of indigenous people or folklore traditions as things that are stuck in a museum, right? And even if we think about it here in the United States, how did things like jazz evolve? How did ballet as we know it right now didn't exist that way until the 20th century. So we have to be aware of that, and we have to let people continue to be creative. So one of the things in the Turantada that people are having concerns with or issues with is what these characters wear. So the Turantada is a dance that represents different eras within the society of Jauja. It goes back to some of the characters represent the colonizers, some of the characters represent the indigenous, some of the characters represent the mestizos or the more acculturated indigenous. And the interesting thing is that all of these different characters coexist within the dance. And I think one of the things that we're always talking about looking at dances or music, and we try to find like a date of origin or a story of origin, kind of like with I don't know, the Avengers or something. What is the origin story? And we have to be really careful in doing that, because a lot of the times, like I said, they're recreating themselves as time goes by. So a dance like this represents different time periods. It could very well represent a colonial period as well as the Republican period and modern times as well. And it's comparing it to the other dances, this is a dance that doesn't necessarily follow a formal choreography. Each character has their own dance steps, and they have to they all perform under the same music. There's no singing when the festivals perform. It's just pure music. And so because of the masks too, it would take a longer talk to talk about the use of the masks in the Andes, but it's this transformative quality of representation. And the mask, again, allows you to safeguard your identity and to recreate it in ways that if you would not be wearing a mask, would not. But there are hundreds of dances in this region that follow different life processes. I always mention that music and dance in the Andes is part of life. It's not that you only dance and you play music at a party, but it's something that you do as you work. There's work dances and work music. And unfortunately, even though we continue to have this very strong living culture, we also have through modernity have lost the ability to understand many of them. And I think that's one of the struggles with youth and younger children that we have these days. So we want to, yes, allow it to adapt, just allow it to change, but at the same time, we want to give people the necessary tools to do that adaptation and that change in a well-informed way. So I wanted to continue on this topic of authenticity and policing. In the modern era, policing of authenticity has sought to circumscribe Andean musical traditions as folkloric, and in many ways, this labeling has served to restrict its development, creating a static and often stereotypical idea of what Andean culture should be. Joshua Tucker, in his work *Gentlemen Troubadours and Andean Pop Stars*, although appearing initially critical of this approach, also fails to fully allow for the creativity of Andean musical performers in a way. In his text, he makes mention of Jose Maria Arguedas's early efforts to police culture in the 40s with the backing of his position in governmental and academic institutions. Arguedas, who was not only a literary figure but also an ethnographer, sought to regulate the authenticity of the performers of the time. In Tucker's work, he describes how, by doing so, Arguedas regulated who could and who could not perform or record. This can be viewed as some of the instances in which even those who attempted to be allies to the indigenous creative voices and expressions effectively policed their creativity and curtailed the agency of these indigenous musicians, singers, and dancers. However, it is interesting to note that in an effort to describe indigeneity, Tucker also engages himself in some sort of cultural policing, labeling the work of Daniela Lomía Robles and others as ultimately non-Andean due to the restrictions. Alomía Robles was a mestizo born in the Peruvian Andes of Huánuco who traveled many years using the same ethnographic methodology that Arguedas and others used, but much earlier in the 20th century. His Condor Pasa cannot solely be judged by its abridged popular recorded version, but must be studied in its entirety. So El Condor Pasa, as hopefully some of you might have heard, Simon and Garfunkel recorded a horrific version known as If I Could, If I Would. But again, this version is based on a bridge version of the main theme. It's the Condor Paz is actually part of a zarzuela that was penned by Julio Balduin, and then the music was written by Daniela Lomía Robles. So it's kind of hard for them to judge it in that, just for the abridged popular version. The historian Jose Varellanos has proven that compositions such as Daniela Lomía Robles' Himno al Sol rely heavily on the transcriptions of the music of partly of Marco Jauja. This is from that area right there. So again, we're coming from the outside and gauging something, and because perhaps it doesn't fit what we believe to be authentic Andean music, or even we term it as indigenista, or we term it as somebody else's reading of it, and discard it. And I think we have to be really, really careful with doing that. The importance of denoting these false generalizations are to shed light on the way in which much of Andean music and dance continue to be at the same time misunderstood and policed. In fact, the efforts of scholars, folkloric institutions, and institutions backed by the government, such as the short-lived Folkloric Ballet of Peru in the 70s, has served to stereotype and create false tropes, or estampas folclóricas, as they are known, of both music and dance. Hence, these are also the only cultural agents that, with their recreations of Andean culture, that were able to travel and show the world Andean culture. So we have people from usually the cities that form these folkloric associations. They create these representations of Andeanness, and they create this metric system, and then they travel outside and they show people what it is to be Peruvian or Andean. And the unfortunate part is that then they return and they police actual communities. So it's very unfortunate. The lack of understanding or care from the government has often empowered Creole cultural producers to police the actual culture of the people in the provinces. In President Velasco Alvarado's Incarris, the national contest held in Lima resulting from this, it was the folklorists who were giving the final say on what was authentic and what was not. The interesting case of someone in modern days, such as folkloric performer Eusebio Chatogrado, shows the problematic aspects of policing authenticity. In his youth, Eusebio and his music were condoned by fellow performers and elder musicians as being those of a con man, especially since he was performing music of a region that was not his own. However, today it is Eusebio himself who has published a small manual of folklore and who continually denounces new performers for not ascribing to his metrics of what a folkloric performer should be. There's literally, he has a little, you can find it, a little manual saying, if you're a folkloric singer, this is what you should wear, this is what you should sing, and it's kind of very funny in that sense. Finally, it is clear that Peru's music and dance traditions have received little attention in ethnomusicology, and I think that's important to note. And much of it has entangled itself in nonsensical debates regarding authenticity. Again, this is an unfair analysis that mostly bases itself on Western understanding of music, attempting time and time again to constrain Andean instruments, musical motifs, structures of rhythm and harmony to Western ones, even though we are slowly working towards getting away from that. So the work I do with Kuyaiki, I work with indigenous communities in the Andes, especially in Jauja. We have also worked with people in the Amazon. And I also wanted to mention this, that in Peru, at least indigenous is nowadays usually refers only to people in the Amazon. People in the Andes are rarely self-identify as indigenous or allowed to be indigenous. This has to do with a lot of history, but again, the leftist rule of Velasco Alvarado did many wonderful things for indigenous culture, but at the same time, he replaced something like the Day of the Indian, and he called it the Day of the Farmer instead. And we think about the linguistic importance of that, where you're turning all indigenous people into farmers, and so you cease to be indigenous. You cease to, through time, identify as indigenous, and so you create a kind of a bigger problem. So within Kuyaiki, like I mentioned, we have different projects. One of the projects that I wanted to really touch base on is we have a children's orchestra in Jauja. We have about 90 kids, and you, again, seeing it from the outside, you might see, but they are playing Western musical instruments like violins and cellos and mandolins, which they play together with charangos and quenas and so forth. But again, it's this. What we try to do is we try to teach them the Andean or the Jaujino style of playing these instruments, and it's a difficult work to do, even when you're transcribing musical notation for them to play, because there are certain riffs and techniques that they need to use that haven't ever been written in this way. So it's a very nice project in that way. And these kids come from the lowest segments of society, and not in all cases. The good thing is, since the classes are free, and since thankfully the orchestra has gained some prestige due to our background, and to people knowing us, basically, we have been able to attract kids who are of different social standings in the community. I think it's one of the only places in Jauja, even perhaps in Peru, where you can have a child from a slightly higher class sitting next to a child from the lowest classes, and having to learn and respect each other for something else, for their technique, for their ability to express and to play. So a lot of these children, to the outside world, are indigenous children. They come from, and I wanted to mention that from the earlier map that we saw, and so we talked about the Sausa nation and the Sausa people. But one of the things I think we need to mention again and again when I talk about heterogeneity in indigenous groups is that migrations have been a constant thing within the Andes. Through the different eras or periods, we have had people from the south move to the north, people from the center move to the Amazon due to distinct circumstances. And I think this is also something that we don't often consider. So a lot of these traditions that we think about, like I mentioned the tunantada before, they always speak about having, it follows a religious cult of Saint Sebastian and Saint Fabian, but nobody really ascribes to that. When you mention why do you dance the tunantada, people really say because of my Sausa identity. And when I started to do in-depth interviews, I started learning that a lot of these people were migrants and are migrants to Jauja. They come from the mining towns, but they feel again that they can identify as something, as Sausa, as indigenous, as tunanteros, and that this gives them, a sense of place and a sense of being. So I think that's important to know. And then again, it's a process that we see it on the names of the different towns. Huaripampa, again, because it went through a process where the Huaris moved into that region, a very different cultural group. So these children today, a lot of them would be considered by elder Jaujino families from the, small center. They would be considered as not Jaujinos. Because they come from migrants from the poorer areas of Huancavelica, Cerro de Pasco, and other places, or the Amazon. But again, these children are there, and they're a result of the process of migrations, and they find the sense of place again here, playing this music. This is kind of so where you can realize yourself and how it's very beautiful. It's very fertile land, which is why we've also had so much economic boom and migrations through the place. And a lot of the projects that we do, like Taki Tushum Kutikuyashum, they come from there's a work that my father transcribed in the 60s, and he recorded, and so we basically have the only musical notation of this piece that has been lost through time. And this piece speaks of a process of migration that happened probably during Inca times, when the people from the coastal area were moved into the central area of Peru, and the hardships that they endured, and also for the literary folks out there, their ability to cope with that. So the lyrics speak to, making fun of having warm, itchy clothes, and just having to wear so many clothes, and their capacity again to adapt and change, which is something that we really want to bring home. So this was a concert that we did in conjunction with people that are studying the Inca Trail, this piece of the trail in Jauja. And again, we wanted to bring forth this idea of movement, of identity, yes, but again, attached to movement and to the different expressions that occur within this region. And here the children are, that I think that took place last week, and we basically took them to the market, El Mercado Modelo, to play music out there, because culture shouldn't be confined to one place or to the elite or so forth. So kind of breaking those boundaries as well, so that children, they've had a chance to play at Peru's Congress. So here they are, and we see that Carnaval Merqueño that was also recognized that day. And I basically wanted to end with that. So let me just read this part. So today's Andean music and dance traditions continue to be unique from the rest of the world because they continue to reflect the cosmology of Andean people. Andean music and Andean cultural expression are a reflection of the telluric landscapes of the Andes and of the endoculturization and transculturization that has occurred since colonization. Thus, the focus of Andean music and dance should not be on its authenticity, but on its current performance. The capacity of Andean people to, as Baker says, negotiate, and more than that, to adapt and enunciate, have proven to be powerful mechanisms of survival. Music in the Andes is, as ethnomusicologist Thomas Turino put it, a sustaining and unifying thread that creates meaning. As performance theorists Diana Taylor and Sola Mendoza note, music and dance and their performance endows their participants with agency, allowing its practitioners to time and time again define and redefine their identity. Thank you.